Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really enjoyed the previous two presentations as well. It's great to be here, and my name is Dr. Daren Fisher, and I'm an assistant professor from Hampton University, from the Department of Sociology, Cybercrime, and Cybersecurity Policy. And my presentation today is on the ebb, flow, and influence of far-right extremism within US public education. Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Dugan, for organizing the event and for organizing it all. So if you can move to the next slide, please. So one of the things that's important to note with everything in the realm of extremism within counterterrorism is that education keeps coming back again and again as an important factor for not just driving where ideas come from, but also seeing how things are passed from generation to generation over time. One of the things that interests me the most in this area is not just how education funding, how education priorities impact decisions that are made on a state-by-state level, but really understanding the mechanisms that underlie the transmission of different ideas, different perspectives as they get transmitted across generations. And so one of the things that we can draw upon from the criminological literature, from the sociological literature, from the education literature, is that early education is particularly formative, it's particularly important for all decisions that are made throughout the life, particularly because young individuals, they learn the rules, they learn how to distinguish good decisions from bad decisions, but also it is important in developing priority structures, particularly what is important, what is not important, what is worthwhile, and what is actually meaningful as we navigate the world that we live in together. And so there's a growing literature that's been long established now that public education in particular is very important for establishing lifelong understandings of many different things. One of the things that has come up again from the research of Skrita, particularly in the work from 2010, is that education provides a key opportunity for one generation to pass on the key lessons and messages and reinterpret the past and pass that on to the next generation in a way that really guides and structures understanding of the broader world in general, not just in childhood, but later on in life. The influence of schooling, however, is mediated by parents, culture, and heritage as well, making this a very, very complicated picture. Education is also importantly influenced as well by accessibility issues, and as well as its relationship on passing on professional and economic mobility as well. Particularly when social class issues are very much divided across the educational spectrum within a country as well, that this can lead to very divergent outcomes again, making it clear that education isn't just one singular thing, particularly with regard to developing innovations for different professional and personal and cultural aspects later in life. And that this leads to an idea that education isn't just one thing, so it needs to be unpacked a little bit more, which motivated the more qualitative approach to this presentation and this branch of research right now. What has become clear, though, in the work of Kaufman and colleagues from 2016 is that the quality of education, the topics that are broached, and the way that these knowledge patterns are reinforced throughout education over early childhood is that this has lifelong impacts on the volume of knowledge, patterns of reasoning, working memory, and the speed at which decisions are made in life. And so education structures and shapes numerous factors, and this is controlled by a variety of different mechanisms, including school criteria, student entrance criteria, and school library catalogs as well. And as I'm sure we're all aware of, this is something that's been hotly politically debated in recent years because of its importance in all of these domains, in controlling narratives and making sure that key ideas are passed on from generation to generation. Particularly when it comes to discretionary topics and frames that are within the classroom, even when there are directions, even when there are mandates, even when there is a sort of a desire to pass on specific messages, one of the things that makes this difficult for quantitative analysis is each individual teacher can also frame topics in different ways and deliver exactly the same material in different ways that can have a lasting impact on students, not just from day to day, but over the course of their life as well. One of the things that has been particularly noted as being particularly important in US schools is performative rituals. For many people that go through education in the United States, one of the common things that's done, for example, is the Pledge of Allegiance. However, the practice of this not just varies across states, where some states have exemptions where you don't have to participate in the Pledge of Allegiance and require some students to remain quiet. But other states have changed this as well over time, as I'll go through in later detail later on. However, One of the things that is clear with this is that these performative rituals in particular are some of the most lasting and well ingrained things that last with individuals throughout the entire lifetime, well and truly after schooling has ended. And if you can click the next slide, there should be something that pops up here on the slide. And so this is one of the reasons why educational systems have been really tightly ingrained in debates around topics of sexuality, race, and as well as the interpretation of historical events, which is what is the focus of this presentation here. One of the difficult things in this domain, in this research domain, is connecting different elements of education to not only just support for political violence, but also into actualizing that these attitudes into political violence itself. And so one of the things that has been established within the literature is that education is linked to extremist attitudes and terrorism, though its relationship is incredibly complex. And again, one of the things that this presentation, subsequent research was aiming to look into is some of the more nuanced ways that different individuals can respond to different legislative changes and how different practices within the classroom can lead to very heterogeneous impacts on violent extremist attitudes. However, one of the things that has been established through the work of Nivette and colleagues in 2021 and 2017 as well is that once established within late adolescence, many of these attitudes tend to be quite stable over the life beyond education as well. And so for these reasons and many others, education has often been proposed as an ideal site for extremism prevention, particularly given that many of the topics that are naturally learned, particularly through classes on history and citizenship, that this marks an important realm for potential prevention. However, this is difficult to actually isolate the impacts of, which I'll get to in greater detail later on. However, regardless of any of these impacts, it's vital to examine both the intentional and unintentional propagation and interrogation of extremist beliefs within educational institutions, and particularly how this varies over time. And so one of the key things that I aim to do through this project is look at some of the attempts throughout US history to really shape and mold the way that education is done, not just within a singular state, but across a whole swath of different states, in order to try and change interpretations of different motivations for understanding history and how the use of violence has been viewed in general. And one of the key case studies that emerges again and again within this existing literature in this area was the influence that the United Daughters of the Confederacy had through the late 19th century and early 20th century, ending at around the end of World War I, although the institution still exists to this day, as we'll discuss over the course of this presentation. One of the key elements of education influence that the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which I'll call the UDC from here on out, was to try to establish a real history and establish that this idea of the lost cause within southern states as part of the Civil War. Specifically, the lost cause tried to establish the glorification of Confederate soldiers, regardless of what was actually done, and provide defenses for slavery, and that it was beneficial for the enslaved, and that slavery was not the root cause for the Civil War. So these were some of the key factors that were trying to be put forward by the UDC. And to do this, they used a number of different techniques, which resonate very clearly and very directly with many of the techniques that we see coming up in current legislative attempts to shape education within the United States. So to do this, a number of different textbooks and guidance packages and policy packages were put forward, with one of the most notable being written by Mildred Rutherford in 1920, which was called A Measuring Rod to Test Books and Reference Books in Schools, Colleges, and Libraries. In this particular model, in this particular policy document that was put forward by Rutherford, what she suggested is that no school in states that adhered to these guidelines should adopt any books that did not accord full justice to the South, and that they should reject a book that calls Confederate soldiers a traitor or rebel, or the war is a rebellion, and to reject books that say the South fought the war to hold on to slaves, and to reject books that speak of the slaveholding in the South as cruel and unjust to slaves. So you can see in these attempts that it's not just trying to change the way that education is passed on in these different ways from one school with one sort of jurisdictional area, but to provide a manual and a model that could be replicated from place to place to place and can be a North Star, so to speak, in this sort of way to try and guide future educational decisions in order to maintain these this mythos that was put forward by the UDC. In addition, the UDC also created an offshoot called the Children of the Confederacy, which tried to provide opportunities and sort of like different support mechanisms in order to drive those who adhere to these messages and provide them different advantages in schooling life as well. However, a lot of this was done through performative ways to demonstrate who adhered to these messages most clearly, most directly, and who could produce these messages as accurately as possible as they were previously written. And so one of the mechanisms for reinforcing this through the Children of the Confederacy was the creation of call and response rituals that conformed to the Confederate Catechism. And so as Hase in 2011 put forward, that these rituals were put forward to try and benefit the children who memorize the catechisms word for word to earn the most points and win the catechism quiz. So this gamification of these processes as well was not just used to sort of like rank order the different students as to how well they conform to these different mythoses, but also to try and provide children an opportunity to tap into their competitive impulses so they can more clearly ingrain and memorize all these different messages that were conducive to different mythoses that we'll go through in more detail in the next slide. So drawing directly from one of the catechism documents that was provided in 1904, the first one that was that we can look through and see in detail is to try and see how the narrative towards violence and understanding violence of the past was put forward, was the student, or the child in this case, was asked what causes led to the war between the states from 1861 to 1865. Immediately you can see here that rather than being called the Civil War, we have a reframing of different arguments in order to make it more palatable, more and to hide away some of the less desirable elements from the perspective of the UDC of understanding what the Civil War was. The response that was expected verbatim from the child was the disregard on the parts of the states of the North for the rights of the Southern or slave-holding states. Next slide, please. And as you can see through the rest of the slide, there was a whole bunch of different catechisms that were here that attempt to reframe and to really enshrine these different messages that were very out of sync with what was the reality that was lived through during the Civil War, in order to try and serve these different messages that could then be passed on from generation to generation, repropagated, and to be maintained as accurately as possible through the desire to have all of these different messages learned verbatim so that it could be reproduced on command, not just within the performative setting, but amongst peers and to pass it on to the next generation as well. And so one of the things that you can see here, which I'll touch on a bit later, was number 16 here, was what were the principles of the Southern people? They believed that each state should regulate her own affairs according to its best interest with no meddling within the management of the states, and that each state should loyally support the Constitution of the United States. And this becomes an important sort of like way of messaging as well, to try and present this glorified narrative of this is what we stand for, but also to recognize, in this case from the UDC, that this was not a form of secession, that this was not a form of rebellion, that everything that was done, even though it was in direct conflict with northern states from their perspective, was still constitutional, to try and reframe these actions rather than being illegal or being connected with different forms of political violence as being actually protected by law. To do this, a lot of the teaching that was done was to try and see history through the personal. That by experientially getting children to perform these sorts of things, not only did it ingrain these ideas clearly and accurately within their minds from the perspective of the UDC, but it also helped them to connect their own identity to these different perspectives on life. However, as Harris and Reynolds note in their article from 2014, for those who did not share these different perspectives or this heritage, this can also alienate individual students as well, again leading to this idea that a singular message could lead some towards these different ideological beliefs and push others in completely the opposite direction. However, again, in all these sorts of educational efforts, the worst of these actions were omitted due to the potentially traumatic impacts of this knowledge, and this provides educational structures that encourage highlighting benefits of these different historical understandings of violence while hiding the damages of these different perspectives on violence itself. And as we can see in different sort of like more contemporary domains when it comes to guiding education, particularly with performative rhetoric in the United States, there is an ebb and flow and there's immense geographic variation. Here I've included some of the different legislative guidance on how the Pledge of Allegiance should be performed in different states from Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Kentucky, and Alaska, where you can see that in some states, children are not required to perform if they're given exemption from a parent or a guardian. And in some states, such as Alaska, the school requires districts to inform people of their rights not to participate in the Pledge of Allegiance entirely. All of these different perspectives, all these different legislative approaches can have very different impacts. And so studying particularly how these different laws change over time within states and across states provides an important opportunity for us to understand how different rhetoric messages, particularly those to do with violence, those to do with patriotism, those to do with the heritage around the United States, provides an important educational enterprise in both qualitative and quantitative perspectives. There's also important variation that needs to be explored qualitatively and quantitatively in states like Oklahoma. Up until 2002, for example, public schools were not instructed to teach about the Tulsa Race Massacre until 2002. And so for many parts of the states, if not most parts of the state, the entire education around the Tulsa Massacre was absent from generation to generation to generation, effectively removing it from the educational understanding of people from Oklahoma within their own state. In 2002, even the way that this was sort of like portrayed and branded, however, was to reframe it in terms of being the Tulsa Race Riot, which again underscored the negative, more traumatic aspects of the massacre itself, which was not ideal, and also falls in line with the framing from the UDC as well, where the more positive elements are highlighted and the more negative elements are shied away with in order to try and move away from things that are being potentially traumatic and lessening the understanding of the negative long-term impacts of these actions. And indeed, legislatively in 2021, this was followed up by a changing of the Oklahoma law in response to the 2002 change that restricted public school teachers and employees from using lessons that make individuals feel uncomfortable, guilt, anguish, or any form of psychological distress on account of their race or sex. So this was put forward as a means to try and provide teachers with the cover for not teaching these moments of violence and political violence in the past, in order to help to glorify these different messages of heritage for some, while diminishing the experiences of violence for others within the state of Oklahoma, presenting again how these different education attempts can ebb and flow over time. One of the things that has become clear, however, within these messages is that many of these messages, particularly to do with the South and the Confederacy, have been used to motivate those towards violence within recent years, particularly with regard to the January 6th attack on the US State Capitol building as well. And so one of the things that this prompted was a statement from the President General of the UDC to try and distance the UDC from these messages, to say that the UDC has stayed quietly in the background and never engaged in public controversy. However, this is clearly not the case. And what these attempts by the UDC were done, particularly through the President General, was to try to all messages from the Capitol. However, as we could all see on January 6th, was that many of these icons, many of these ideas that were enshrined by the UDC in education over generation to generation were used and chanted in the Capitol building, and many of the iconography, including the Confederate battle flag, as you can be seen here, would come up again. Next slide, please. And so again, in defense, the UDC pointed out that its messages clearly said that they should loyally support the Constitution of the United States in all cases. So these actions are not in line with the different educational approaches that they tried to advocate for in the past. However, next slide, please. This was the case for all the catechisms that were put forward. In particular, number 51, which asked what was the spirit of the army. The child was expected to respond verbatim, always ready to follow the leaders and never willing to give up the fight. Victory or death was the motto. So we have inconsistencies here. We have different issues with this here that, again, qualitative research and understanding is necessary to sort of dissipate all the different heterogeneous impacts that come from these different messages on any different child. And so important lessons that we can take away from this is that terrorism and extremist violence is still rare. Even though these messages were quite common, throughout many states across many generations, terrorism and extremist violence was not taken by many people, and that particularly within many different political spheres, this was not something that was involved in violence. It seemed to be something that was more in line with heritage. It's difficult to establish any kind of statistical identification for any of these things as well, because what's learned in childhood may take many, many years to come to fruition, and it's likely going to be influenced by all kinds of different family things as well. However, state law changes themselves present some key quantitative research opportunities as well to look at, particularly the symbolic emboldenment, that when these laws change, does this result in different patterns of hate crime and extremist violence within states that in these, even though the legislation itself is educational and focused on children, and are there any long-term effects as well? Even though there's heterogeneity in educational practice, there's opportunities here to look at the impacts of these policies as well over time. And I'll stop there in interest of time. Thank you very much for your time. I'm looking forward to all of your questions later. And thank you to Dugan as well for controlling the slides. I really appreciate it.